Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm Aimee Terese, and this is What's Left.
So today on What's Left, we're going to talk about retired people and the role retired people play in democratic politics. And this is kind of brought on by an email I had from somebody asking me, hey, what class are retired people in? What's their class background? And then Aimee and I had a conversation about it, and we started thinking about how retired programs for retired people in the United States are different from programs for retired people in other countries, and how this creates a certain distance between retired people and other people in American society that doesn't necessarily exist everywhere. And so with that in mind, Aimee, tell the American listeners how programs for retired people work in places that aren't America.
Well, I don't know if I could be as comprehensive to say, what happens everywhere, but at least in Australia, we have sort of vaguely similar provisioning in terms of like the amount of, a cash welfare payment that you'll receive for the duration of your retirement, in addition to Medicare. But some of the key differences are that the funding for those are not sequestered off into a specifically purpose-built account such that the annual federal budget will, and therefore like the particular government will have a really significant impact on retired people and the degree of retirement security that they have. So our old person's pension is something that's determined on an annual basis by the federal government. So if we have a conservative government in charge, they're the ones doing, making the decisions as to what gets cut, what services get cut, like the degree to which the public health service is, adequately funded. So older retirees, particularly those who don't have a great deal of personal, who don't have a personal retirement fund, they are very much like a part of sort of the democratic, the demos, so to speak. So, if we elect like a revanchist conservative government, that's going to be impacting on retirees in ways that I think in the States they appear to be a little more sequestered from, because you've sort of separated your provision of Medicare and Social Security is sort of separate from the annual whims of different administrations. Is that correct?
Yeah, there have been efforts by, say, George W. Bush in 2005 to attempt to privatize elements of Social Security, elements of Medicare. But these programs have been around for more than half a century. Medicare was created under Lyndon Johnson in the 60s. Social Security dates back to FDR in the 1930s. And despite a long series of Republican presidents who could have gutted them, either the Republican presidents don't try, or if they try, they tend to face some kind of congressional resistance that prevents it from going through. George W. Bush, even though he had a large amount of Republicans in Congress, was not able to push through his entitlement reform in 2005. So even though there has sometimes been interest in gutting these programs, it's been politically very difficult to do, in part because the funding mechanism is tied to a payroll tax, which is specifically for Social Security and Medicare, and therefore not linked to general fund spending and not vulnerable to tax cuts that hit, say, the income tax.
Yeah, and I think there's also something really different, at least in sort of the way that provision is framed in the eyes of citizens. Because if you're paying a payroll tax for the entirety of your working career on the proviso that when you retire, like, you will get Social Security, right? Like when we use the term entitlement or entitled, it can sort of have negative connotations, but like, I think there is sort of something legitimate in that notion where if it's like, you know, I've been paying into, they perceive it as having been this fund into which they paid for the majority of their career, then there is sort of like this broad consensus about like the extent to which everyone is entitled to it, rather than it being sort of this means-tested thing that is taken from like the general budget for the state writ large, right?
Yeah, and so if someone goes after Social Security or Medicare, it feels like they're trying to steal something from people, that
including people who are more well off. Yeah,
right. You contributed to this with a tax on your payroll, and now the state is saying, oh, that promise that we made you about what we would do with your payroll tax revenue, we're not keeping that. That goes over very poorly. Whereas I think in other states, the impression I'm getting from you is that it's a lot more like ordinary social spending.
It's exactly that.
Like
it's also means tested as well. So like, the more wealthy you are, the less inclined you are to be getting any form of old age pension. Like, it cuts out at a certain point, and it also decreases based on wealth, which is also like, it has other sort of complications built in, such that like, if you're an elderly person who lives in, say you bought your house in the 1960s, you may have literally no like liquid assets, right? Like, you have no income from other sources. You have no like day-to-day leisure expenditure, none of that. But like, purely based on the fact that the property market has increased exponentially in value, you're sitting on an asset, but then that can be used by the government to diminish your ability to receive the elderly pension, which feels incredibly fucking unfair, right? Like, if the house that you're in is just like a totally banal, you know, your family home, but you have no income as an elderly person, and then like basically the government's saying, oh, well, like, we're going to be reducing your eligibility for the old age pension because, like, you know, we valued the property that you're living in at X amount of dollars, but it's like, you don't have, that's not like money that you have, that's just like this abstract number that someone has declared to you. You know what I mean? So it's basically very good at sort of, in one way, kind of dividing people, but yet at the same time, it tends to sort of divide them along class lines in many of the same ways that like they would ordinarily vote. Like in Australia, most people are going to tend to vote the way that they did as workers. They're going to tend to vote that way as retirees, generally.
Yeah. So one of the things that we were kind of thinking about before we started up is to what extent retired people have the same class profile as people who work in their jobs who are younger, in their former jobs. And your impulse was to say, yeah, basically they do. If you're a working class person who's retired, you're still working class. And I was a little bit, not to say that it's entirely different, but I think that being retired, at least in the States, does shift your material position a bit. Because now something like Medicare for All, which previously you would have been a beneficiary of before you reached the retirement age, is now an expansion to a program that you already benefit from. And so it's much less appetizing.
Yeah, like basically the way the incentives work is just slightly different. So my impulse is such that, for example, here, if you were to get any kind of conservative government in charge, they're going to start cutting funding for Medicare. Ours is called Medicare. But the way Medicare works is you have both public and private health insurance. It's like you guys would call it supplemental or whatever. But you can also go through just the purely public system, or you can sort of see more expensive doctors and go through like private hospitals and that sort of thing if you want a bit more like just like a kind of slightly more fancy experience. But basically, like if any conservative government comes in, they will start cutting funding to the public services. And so anyone who's retired and is like a working class retiree is going to dramatically feel the impact of any cuts or increases to Medicare. Like that impacts them in the same way as it impacts, you know, a working or middle class person, you know, with kids, right? Like cuts to Medicare affect older people in the exact same way as they affect other people. Whereas it seems in the States that sort of the degree to which older people are protected from or sort of sequestered away from those like potential changes in programming sort of provides a different set of incentives when they're contemplating like the role of the state and the sort of role of programs on other members of the population.
Right. Particularly because in the States, a lot of Americans are not on any kind of government-provided healthcare. So they're not on Medicaid. They're not on the Children's Health Insurance Program. Most of them have too much income to qualify for those programs. And so they're in this no man's land where they might get a private sector program through Obamacare, perhaps, but that would still be private insurance. And so these Americans are vulnerable to fluctuations in the private health insurance market and in price inflation in that market, which old people are protected from because they're on Medicare.
And do you think, for example, something like telling elderly people like the idea of like Medicare for all, would they perhaps be a little bit apprehensive about that? Is that possible?
Yeah, to a degree, because for retired people in America, anytime anyone talks about changing Social Security or Medicare in any way, there's apprehension about that and uncertainty about what someone might be trying to smuggle in by doing that.
So yeah, there's a lot of like loss aversion, like worry about.
Yeah, and there's a lot of misunderstanding of how it works. The old saying is, get your government hands off my Medicare.
So weird.
Yeah.
Americans.
And the Republicans are already pushing Medicare for all as an assault on actual Medicare. They are already trying to frame it as some kind of effort by the Democrats to gut it in much the same way that the Democrats frame Republican efforts to privatize Medicare as attempts to gut it.
Except for one of them is accurate and one of them is not.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so this is just one kind of basic example of this more general thing, which is that retired people, especially in the United States, seem to have certain different kinds of experiences, material experiences from the bulk of the voting population. And not just in this area, but in other areas. And a lot of the time, people play a kind of generational politics, which is just stereotyping. And I want to stay away from that. But I do think that we can often find that different age cohorts grow up under different policy schemas and different technological paradigms, and that these things have a certain amount of influence over their situations. So, for instance, another thing that's changed over time is that defined benefit pension plans have gone away. So it used to be that very large numbers of retired Americans not only had Social Security and Medicare, but they also had a defined benefit pension that paid out a quite large fixed quantity of benefit. And now those defined benefit pensions are increasingly replaced by defined contribution plans that don't pay out nearly as much. And in some cases, they're just scrapped altogether, and these workers are doing without pensions of any kind. So workers now have much less additional help with retirement from their employers and from the state than they used to have a few decades ago.
Yeah, like as a part of neoliberal financialization, they were sort of taken out of the hands of like individual employers, which were being pressured for a long time by unions to provide that benefit to their workers, and instead like are now put on financial speculative markets such that, you know, the extent to which whatever you even have in that pension is totally vulnerable to the fluctuations of a international financial market is also like a very real aspect of that whole.
And so the state they'll protect your Social Security and their Medicare and the Medicare, but they will make your pension plan turn from something that was at one point in time very reliable and dependable to something that is much weaker. And that's the first thing that's really changed. And of course, there are continuing efforts to try to gut or to reduce the benefits of Social Security and Medicare, but those are much more slow going. They've found that they can much more easily diminish the social obligation to the elderly by moving away from these defined benefit plans to these defined contribution plans. And it's going to, indeed it is already, leading to a bit of a crisis for older people because older people now have much less to retire off of than 20 or 30 years ago. And so people who are retiring now are in a very different situation from, say, my grandparents when they retired.
And you combine that with the fact that people are living longer now too, or at least many people. I don't know about people in the Rust Belt, but broadly speaking, the general life expectancy has been getting older over the generations. So you've got sort of that. It's
in the States, there's a class divide on that.
Yeah.
In the States, professional class people are living longer and working class people are not.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another thing that's changing. And I think it may change a little bit, to some degree, the politics of older people, because if you switch from an older population that is secure, has healthcare, has an adequate income, has adequate housing, and these things are stable, then you might get conservative voting, but it would be a different kind of conservative voting than you might get out of an older population that is more precarious. Because a more precarious older population, I think you made the argument that it might be more vulnerable to a kind of Trumpy sort of message.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing that I had particular concerns about is like when you add together this sort of like multivariate set of influences, like on the one hand, you've got, like, for example, it's one thing to be in a really precarious position as a younger person, which, you know, that can make you more vulnerable to kind of more reactionary messaging and kind of, you know, scapegoating and that sort of thing. But at the same time, like, you're also existing in a much more, you're existing with a different relationship to the world as it currently is, right? Like, if you're younger, you're going to have very different news consumption habits. You're going to, broadly speaking, these are generalizations, obviously, you're going to have very different set of capacities and potential to attempt to try to build new earning potential. Whereas if you're an older person, sort of in your 70s, for example, you don't really have any real capacity to find a way out of your position by, you know, changing careers or learning how to code or doing any of those sorts of things. And you're also not going to be, like, the chances are that you're getting most of your information from, you know, Sinclair Public Media, cable news, and just like talkback radio. So you're going to be getting. Oh yeah,
this is something I kind of want to talk about for a second. This one of the things I think that is really distinctive about the older generation is that this is a group of people who, when they started to pay attention to the news and politics, were getting it from local newspapers, local TV, and then, if they're slightly younger, cable news on TV. And this makes them very different from, say, the under 30s who watch almost no TV and read almost no print media directly and are getting almost everything either from social media or online websites. And if you haven't watched TV for a while, it's so different. It's so different from the internet. There's a much stronger centrist stranglehold over print media and television media than there is over online.
Yeah.
And that's why the print media and the TV media have been flipping out over Facebook and Russians on the internet and Russian hackers, Russian trolls, all of that stuff, which we talked about a few weeks back. And older people are quite likely to believe that because they're not really, many of them are not really on this stuff, aren't up on it, don't know what's going on. And so if the print media or the TV media says that these platforms are overrun with foreign spooks, they might believe that.
Well, basically,
in a way that we would be more skeptical of.
Yeah, their entire engagement with that, like, medium is entirely and exclusively pretty much mediated through a set of commercially interested actors, right? Like, this is a generalization, but for the most part, sort of people in their 70s and 80s have very limited familiarity with, you know, using the internet in the ways that people of our generation do. And so, like, they don't even have, like, the sort of cursory familiarity to be able to spot bullshit when people are speaking about these mediums because they're so unfamiliar with them. And then the people who are speaking to them about these mediums are commercially interested actors through a very narrow set of cable channels and talkback radio. So all of that information is straight up secondhand, and it's invested actors telling them things that benefit institutional interests that are not necessarily the same as their own.
Right. It's all gatekept by media oligarchs.
Yeah.
And this is not to say that everybody's like this. I have a number of older people who follow my blog and follow me on Facebook, and we talk, and they're some people are up on stuff. But the bulk either aren't on the internet at all, or if they are on the internet, oftentimes they're very credulous. They don't know what to look for. They don't know how to evaluate the content that they see online. They're not up on the subcultures. And so they can mistake things that they see.
It's also, I think, even just a generational thing in terms of the degree to which, like, questioning grand narratives and being a skeptical consumer of information is something that I think is also has a generational inflection, right? Like, I don't think that, like, for example, even our parents' generation had the same degree of sort of institutionalized skepticism in their sort of educational process, right? Like, even in high school English, we were taught to sort of to look skeptically and critically at, like, propaganda type materials and how to, like, you know, like, and I hate to, like, give critical theory any kind of credibility, but, like, a lot of people who were growing up in, like, the 60s especially did not go through an educational system that told them to look critically at institutional actors. So it's like both the unfamiliarity with the internet as such, and then also like a cultural age difference in the way that they were sort of enculturated towards media.
Yeah, for many of these people, Vietnam and Watergate are not things that come along until their late teens. And for some of them, even when they're considerably older than that. So that whole shift in skepticism of the establishment came a couple decades into their lives rather than immediately from their inception into the education system.
Yeah,
I think that's
and I think they can then see
difference.
Those as like outliers or exceptions, you know, and that's why we still see a lot of people who see things like Watergate. It's like this exceptional thing that, like, you know, Woodward and Bernstein blew the lid off, rather than being sort of like rather than that translating to a generalized, like, degree of skepticism about institutions broadly. It's that they were like the exceptions that prove the rule, you know?
Yeah, they don't have any kind of generalized awareness of all the other weird stuff that was going on in the Cold War. It's just Vietnam and Watergate as far as they're concerned. Yeah, because that other stuff wasn't reported on and didn't become major media narratives and isn't part of their consciousness.
And even just like a Cold War era type skepticism towards like the threat is like something sort of external, you know? The idea that like it takes an external bad actor as opposed to being like, no, actually we can just have fucked up institutions at home, you know? Like it doesn't take an outside threat.
Movie thing, that whole James Bond thing is predicated on the idea of the outside threat. And this is the retired people in our society at this point are still all old enough that they grew up in a Cold War world.
Yeah.
With the kind of Cold War good guys, bad guys, Manichean division.
Well, I mean, it was only 91 that sort of, you know, that really was, like, the cap was totally put on that. So, like...
And this manifests in the attitude to socialism because a lot of retired people are still viewing socialism as some kind of Soviet project.
Which is why the whole Russiagate thing had such traction, I think.
Yeah, it plays into what they remember from when they were kids.
Plugging into existing sort of like cultural scripts or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, scripts that exist for older Americans, but not for us. And then were spread and fed to them through television and print media, which we're much less receptive to and much more skeptical of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's odd.
Which is why I think...
Another thing about older people, so one of the things that you would think about retired people is that retired people have a lot of free time because they're retired. And so one would think that retired people would be more informed. And I think if you look at retired people who participate in politics, they do spend more time consuming political media and content than younger people do. I think they do. But that time is predominantly spent sitting in front of televisions.
Yeah, receiving the wisdom of Fox News, Sinclair Media, and a very narrow set of very interested narratives that are being perpetrated for a particular purpose. And so, like, I don't want to in any way fall into the trap of suggesting that, like, Fox News is, like, radicalizing your grandma. But just that quite simply, when you perpetrate a set of very narrow concoctions to a set of people who are not embedded in the world in ways that mean they're receiving counter narratives also, then they're going to be more inclined, I think, to be both receptive, not even so much receptive to, but just that that's the information that they're getting. And then they're also in a very precarious material position because they're not able in any way, shape or form to have a degree of sort of like agency or capacity to change their material position. Like you are in a very vulnerable position as an older person if your continued existence is entirely dependent on just the social security benefits that you're receiving. So you're feeling like materially insecure on the one hand, and then you're getting a very limited set of like quite fear-provoking type narratives from a very narrow set of media actors. It can just be...
And it doesn't even have to be Fox and Sinclair. A lot of them are getting it from CNN.
CNN,
a lot of them are getting it
MSNBC. Like, I really want to dispel the notion that there's some drastic difference or qualitative difference.
The late shows from Stephen Colbert, from Seth Meyers, from all of this stuff. Yeah. It doesn't even have to be exceptionally right wing. A lot of this kind of centrist TV is still quite establishment Democrat in its leanings and perfectly compatible with, say, being for Joe Biden.
Well, they benefit from playing up that just like totally binary distinction between like Republicans and Democrats, as though there was this, massive chasm between the two. They're the same fucking thing, right?
Yeah. I remember my grandmother, who I loved very dearly. She reached a point where, although she made an effort to get online in her old age, her eyes just wouldn't allow it. She couldn't read the screens anymore. She couldn't even read the print media anymore without a magnifying glass. And so she was kind of pushed into consuming a lot of television media and watching very large amounts of C-SPAN. Just actually watching congressional proceedings on the floor, and a lot of NPR. She used to watch Charlie Rose all the time. She'd call the house and go, "I've been watching Charlie Rose. Are you near the television set? You want to check this out?" And she was really up on stuff. She knew all the senators' names. She knew all the members of Congress. She was quite up on quite a bit from all of this, but it was all television stuff. So whatever the TV narrative was, that's what my grandma had. And if there were other things going on where previously a few years ago when her eyes were a little bit better, she might have read it in one of the magazines she subscribed to. That was just not stuff that she could get at.
It's also,
and I see it a little bit with my dad too. My dad, who spent, he reads the Chicago Tribune and he watches the WGN local Chicago news and he watches Colbert and Myers, and that's what he does. And it's not a very diverse palette. It's a bit limited. He gets those same couple of Chicago columnists every week, and he feels like he's getting informed because this is what, for people of his generation, it means to be informed.
Well, yeah, and
but from our point of view, it's not quite what we have in mind.
It's almost like at least at the present, for a leftist political project, the immediate threat to us, in terms of enacting what we want to enact, the immediate and prescient threat is that of the establishment Democrats. And so even if you are being a very informed consumer of all of those types of sources that you cited, you're not going to be given the information to be able to appreciate what's actually going on and the potential importance, or even you're simply not getting enough information to assess what's going on politically in any kind of broad sense, right? Because you're being presented essentially with the Democratic Party line and not the...
Yeah, and despite all of this, say my dad voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. Despite all of this.
Yes, but he's plugged in a slightly different way, in as much as he has children of your age, right? Whereas somebody who's older...
And not just that he has children of my age, but he has children of my age who have got pro-Bernie Sanders views, and he respects and cares about that.
Yeah, exactly.
And it matters to him. Whereas I think a lot of people, even if their kids were for Bernie, their attitude is, well, you're a kid, what do you know? And they're not necessarily going to take any political signaling from their children.
Or even if they're just fucking liberals who, will happily have, all the fucking discourse over the Thanksgiving table with their kids that is, respectful and all the rest, they still, don't agree, because liberalism has taught them to just engage in the discourse, but not to actually substantively commit to anything.
Right. And so what I'm saying is that my dad is the kind of older person who votes for Bernie, and even my dad is getting virtually all of his information from this narrow set of establishment traditional media sources. So if even Bernie supporting older people are in that boat, then it's tough from an informational standpoint. We're at a real disadvantage.
Yeah, I think it's also for instance, when you cited like your grandma sort of like watching all the like congressional hearings and that sort of thing, it sort of just reminded me of like a simple analog. Like, you know, when people will look at the voting record of, say, sitting senators or House members, and you know how they'll be able to rank them according to like how progressive their voting history is or whatever. And that particular way of assessing things is necessarily narrowed to like the status quo, right? Like, so for instance, someone like a Kamala Harris or a Hillary Clinton is going to have actually very similar like voting records to someone like Bernie Sanders, because within the parameters of what has already happened, like within the parameters of the status quo, like they are progressive. And so it implies like that they are substantively the same or very similar, solely because like what Bernie's trying to do is actually advance and change things and push beyond the bounds of what has already been proposed and enacted in ways that it's his forward-facing proposals for change that mark him out as a very distinct candidate, offering a very distinct and different vision, like a very different political vision. But if you're only looking at things that have happened up to now, that distinction between him and alternatives is totally collapsed, right? So for instance, when Hillary and Bernie were running, you could look at their voting records and it would say that they're like 94% the same or whatever. But what that fails to capture is that the fundamental difference between them is the change proposition as opposed to what they've voted for up to now.
Yeah, and even when you're watching C-SPAN, which isn't mediated by some TV host, but is just raw footage of what's going on the floor, the politicians are giving speeches on the floor which frame the discussion in various kinds of ways.
Within the bounds of what's already occurring. Like what's already the politically
and
possible.
Which are mainly exercises in rhetoric.
Bernie's trying to expand the bounds of the politically possible, whereas everything that's happening at present is within the terrain of what is the possible within the status quo. And Bernie's saying, no, we need to blow that open and fundamentally change that, right? So if you're only, yeah, I think you get what I mean.
Right. And so right now, because of the current technological gap between the older people and the younger people, if you want to reach older people with an anti-establishment message, that message has to somehow go mainstream enough to get on TV or to get into the big newspapers before old people have even seen it. And since old people are a very large and quite powerful voting bloc, it's hard for anti-establishment messages to get enough traction to be considered even worth looking at by media or by TV, even leaving aside the possibility that certain media moguls may have it out for Bernie and may blacklist him from receiving coverage. Even if they're willing to cover Bernie, it's hard to demonstrate that the project is serious because the group of people that you need to reach to make that case are people who can only be reached through these media outlets, which themselves are not going to pay attention to Bernie until the case has already been made.
Or
Does that make sense?
Yeah, or once they do start paying attention to him, they're seeing the threat. And so what they're presenting is a very strong and robust counter-narrative. Like I'm reminded of like, for instance, like the 18, what was it? Like 16 or 18 anti-Bernie pieces in the Washington Post in like a 24-hour period in 2016. Like that's
right.
something, you know?
You go from him being totally ignored to a series of hit pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you even just get, like, I think that collapsed distinction matters too. Like I try to, being a glutton for punishment, I try to absorb enough like shit-lib media and in some right-wing media too. And I think there's a very distinct effort to collapse the distinction between, say, like a a Liz Warren and a Bernie Sanders. And so whilst I think Liz Warren isn't really a real threat because she's not polling high enough, I do think that quite often, like, one way to neutralize the more radical actor is to just imply that the more moderate actor is ideologically committed to the same things, but is a more practical option, can achieve them more effectively. You know, so like Hillary, I'm reminded of Hillary Clinton being like, I'm a progressive that gets things done, like that sort of thing. So rather than hit pieces,
and now the people who make it out
like
Hillary Clinton was somehow to the left of Joe Biden.
Oh yeah, I can't even with that shit. Like what? What are you talking about?
Yeah. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. All of this is so historically contingent. If we had if the older generation had grown up with roughly the same kinds of media technology that we grew up with, then its relationship to all of this stuff would be totally different. And if the older generation had the same kinds of pension programs that we now have, there would be a lot more similarity between how older people relate to politics and younger people relate to politics. There are a couple of discrete differences, some of which are just pure accidents of technology and some of which are the result of public policies which treat older and younger people differently in a very direct way.
Well, I even think there's
create this gap.
Yeah, I think both of those, but there's also just that I think like you referred to historical contingencies. So as you said, you've got the technology factor, you've got the policies that treat younger and older people differently. But I also think there's just there's been a neoliberal restructuring such that the world and the democratic society into which older people grew and existed is so radically and fundamentally different now that that in relating to sort of the rest of the population, there's kind of an epistemic gap for older people in as much as it's very easy to sort of think retrospectively about what things were like at your age. But that's not what things are like for younger people now. Right?
Yeah, I think it's easier for us to imagine how older people differ from us than it is for them to imagine how we differ from them.
Yeah, because we have all the historic information.
We can watch television.
Yeah.
We can watch newspapers. We can read newspapers. We can consume that media in roughly the same way that they consume it.
We can
but
dream.
They cannot do that with our media.
Well, yeah, we can also dream about being able to relatively easily get a good union job and be able to, afford a house with if a house is on average an annual year's salary. Whereas now, at least in Australia, a house is on average 20 years salary. And that's before you factor in interest rates. Whereas historically, from my dad's generation and certainly my grandparents, a house was half of an annual salary. And so there have been qualitative shifts in the degree, in the ability of people to be able to build a life for themselves that I think are not, older people, if they wanted to and if they're deeply interested, they could sort of wrap their head around those fundamental differences. But I don't think it's a natural, intuitive thing. It's not a matter of them just recalling what things were like for them at our age. It's that the world, and particularly the structure of the labor market is so fundamentally different as a result of neoliberal restructuring that simply empathizing with, what things were like at a different era is it's not apt. The analogy doesn't hold. And so if you're using mere thinking through things as the way you sort of come to your politics, which is the way most people do, right? They're not sort of looking up charts about the differences and that sort of thing. They're just sort of thinking like perhaps younger people
are
are more
even aware
entitled.
of the statistics.
Like they're not aware of like the fundamental differences and changes. Then I think that can be perhaps a barrier to sort of to solidarity, and to also recognizing like the similarity of interests and or the like relating sort of appropriately or accurately to what's actually going on in the world for other citizens.
Yeah. And then to kind of circle back to what we started with, you made this point on Twitter earlier today about liberals tending to build coalitions through special dispensations to groups. And so if you're giving dispensations to older people through Medicare and through Social Security, and you're not revoking those things, but you are going after younger people in all kinds of different ways. You're making the university system more expensive. You're making their healthcare more expensive. You're making their jobs more precarious.
Making their schooling shittier.
All of these things.
And like less available and less useful and all that sort of thing, yeah.
Mm-hmm. All of these things you're chipping away at, but you're leaving intact, or at least mostly intact, the programs that are for the older people. Then even the core perception of what's going on with neoliberalism is going to be radically different depending on which age cohort you're in. Even leaving aside the imagining of how life is different for young people compared to what it was like for old people a long time ago, they don't experience the political change of the last 40 or 50 years the same way in real time either.
Yeah.
And this is in part because politically, political parties know that if you touch that stuff, that you get more pushback, much more pushback. You're much more likely to face some kind of real penalty in terms of seats if you touch Social Security, if you touch Medicare, and particularly if you touch them in a very obvious, overt, significant way.
Yeah, which is why when people try to do it, they're doing it sort of behind closed doors in shady fucking ways.
Yeah. And so this gives you a certain level of security if you're an older person, because these things are less vulnerable. And even if they were to reform Social Security or Medicare at this point, they would grandfather in the people who are currently covered. It would be the people who are younger who would lose benefits. It would not be the people who currently receive them, because everyone knows they can't go back to work. So the older generation who are currently on those benefits knows that they don't even have anything to fear from those reforms, because those reforms would not touch them. So this creates a lot of isolation. And if you think about it, the way that the Coalition for Capitalism is constructed is by finding different groups with expectations that are easy to meet or easy enough to meet, and kind of stringing those groups together into these loose, ill-fitting coalitions. And if you look at the post-war world, in that time period, you've got a lot of stuff that is meant to keep working class people and even maybe add some lower class people through straight up welfare programs and the war on poverty to a coalition which recognizes the system as in some way legitimate. And what seems to have happened over time is that the set of classes that can plausibly be included in that legitimation coalition for capitalism has decreased, and even the groups that are kept in are receiving diminished versions of what they were previously receiving. And before we got on, I remember saying that what are the most important groups, the groups that you can't afford to lose if you're capital, to secure enough votes to keep socialists from being competitive in elections? Well, one, you need the troops for obvious reasons. Two, you would need the professional class because the professional class is your house slaves. It's your people that you treat just well enough that they feel like they can buy into that meritocracy story that you tell about how everyone ends up where they deserve.
And they're also your ideological cops, right? They're controlling the ideological apparatus by which the majority of people are getting their information of and understanding of the system. Right.
The professional class works in the media. The professional class works for those newspapers, works for those television networks. So you need them. They're essential not just to supply votes for themselves, but they're also essential for carrying the message forward into the rest of the population.
They're the myth makers, sort of, for the whole apparatus.
What would the third group be? I think the third group that you really want to get, if you're capital, is the retired people. Because the retired people, you can enlist to support cuts to all kinds of other stuff if you will rationalize those cuts as in some way, shape, or form defending the position of Social Security, Medicare, and old age programs. If you say we've got to cut this other stuff so that we've got the money to pay for old age programs, older people don't really have a choice there. If they actually believe that that is the choice, they have got to look after themselves because they're not capable, in most cases, of returning to work. So if you can't return to work, then anytime anyone constructs this binary choice between austerity for everybody else and cuts to old age programs, you have to defend the old age programs.
Yeah, and I also think there's a very, similar, I was sort of thinking about this before we got on, about, sort of the similarity to the military in terms of, you provide material provisioning for these two groups, but it's kind of sequestered away from the material provisioning for the rest of the democratic body. And then, ideologically and sort of discursively, they're a lot more prone, despite the sort of social welfare provisioning that is provided to them, they're still vulnerable to and sort of ensconced within a rhetorical context where they're going to be more prone to a lot more conservative ideology. Whereas contrary to that, if you're giving sort of similar levels of material welfare benefit, but in a universal fashion, you'll tend to find that creates a sense of sort of solidarity and fellow feeling amongst the broad population, such that they're not going to be as sort of conservative and vulnerable to sort of fear-making and reactionary demagoguery or whatever. If you look at sort of the social provisioning in welfare state, it's it creates a much greater sense of fraternity and collectivity. But if you give these sort of special dispensations that have a very real material benefit to people, but you do it in a way that's sequestered, then it sort of creates this very strong sense of loss aversion. And they're getting the material benefits, but it's it's sort of has the exact opposite effect, because rather than giving it to everyone, you've just given it to these sequestered sort of cloistered groups that then are getting really reactionary ideology and sort of have just a very strong sense of loss aversion towards any of their material benefits being taken away.
Yeah, and you see this in all of these liberal efforts to do special dispensation. Anytime that liberals are doing kind of group recognition and then special dispensation, because the benefits and the programs are for specific targeted groups, it creates a kind of adversarial zero-sum relationship among the groups and reifies the distinctions among those groups. And we've talked about this in relation to, say, reparations a while back. But there's something similar going on.
Medicare for all and Medicaid, the sort of the animosity it creates between people who are sort of having to pay a shit ton in premiums and co-pays for like a Medicare, for a Obamacare plan. Whereas if they were earning just a little bit less, they'd be eligible for Medicaid, and that creates, intra-class hostility, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Like
anytime that you've got different
testing,
programs for different groups of people, then you get hostility. But if you are able to get everybody on the same program, then that creates solidarity.
This is another reason why
true all over the place
most of
and
Liz
on so many
Warren's
issues.
plans are terrible. This is why most of Liz Warren's plans should just be anathema to a left-wing project, because they're just chock full of all manner of means testing, which doesn't foster solidarity.
And then also, if you look at these older age programs, like there's a meritocracy angle, because the way that our old age programs are presented in the States, you earn Social Security and Medicare through working, because it's paid for through payroll tax. So it's considered yours that you earned meritoriously through your hard work. So although it's an entitlement, it's still tied to you having spent decades working hard.
Yeah, to your personal responsibility, to the fact that you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not actually we have a mutual investment in government provision and collective social services. It's merely that the government has effectively been a caretaker for your personal contributions.
Yeah, it's like the government has acted like an insurance company.
Yeah.
Insuring your retirement.
Rather than,
it isn't solidaristic in the same kind of way. And that's built into the way that Social Security was constructed through a payroll tax. The funding mechanism, I think, on Social Security and Medicare was always kind of messed up from the beginning.
I mean, it has
and this
pros
is
and
for
cons,
political
though, right?
reasons.
It's contradictory, though. Like, for instance, in Australia, like, there is something I think very problematic in that if you get like a shitty conservative government, they can just absolutely wallop social services and old age pensions in ways that have like really deleterious effects on the material well-being of pensioners. So it's sort of, there's that tension. Like it's not easy to figure out ways that these special dispensation programs can be beneficial, because almost by definition, like anytime you start doing things in these sort of divisive type ways, as opposed to sort of telling people that you have a universal entitlement as a member of a state, that like you're entitled to be cared for and taken care of. Anytime you start trying to split that up and parcel it out based on different conceptions of who's worthy, then you start
even if it's just an age cutoff.
Yeah.
Even that age cutoff can create a kind of identitarian division that creates antagonisms across the division.
Exactly.
And so the more times you deploy this special dispensation thing, the more you reify a wider and wider array of divisions. And then that makes it quite easy to divide and conquer, because you can present any effort to change any part of this system of public service provision as a potential threat to the programs that favor the particular groups.
Yeah. So it's like a form of like almost blackmail to keep them on board. So you have politicians running around speaking out of both sides of their mouths to all these different little special cohorts, rather than, for example, someone like Bernie Sanders, who has a very, people get the shits that his message is very, like they say, repetitive. It's like, it's consistent. It's consistent and honest. He doesn't need to run around giving like, a different, blowing smoke up different special interest groups' bottoms in order to get them on board,
Yeah. I still think I'd rather have the Australian funding mechanism than ours, because if we had something more like the Australian funding mechanism, then that would mean that at least when some part of public services in the welfare state are under attack, everybody would get involved, because it wouldn't be something that's been bracketed off and treated as separate in the same way, because it comes out of the general fund as opposed to a payroll tax, which is kind of turned into its own separate para-government or para-state that runs alongside the general fund.
Yeah, I think there are very real risks associated with that. for the first time in a very long time, last federal election, so we had Medicare for All instituted in the 1970s by initially a Labor Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam. And, ever since then, basically, the Conservative government has been attempting to figure out ways to just slowly chip away at it and privatize it and this, that, and the rest. But and Labor over the neoliberal period has just been utterly pathetic. But finally, last federal election, in response to sort of a lot of very austere budgets in the preceding years from the coalition government, Labor basically did some kind of like rat fuckery in one particular state in relation to Medicare. They just sent out like a shit ton of mailers to elderly people basically saying like the government's going to cut Medicare in massive ways, like you're going to be screwed. The government's doing horrible things to Medicare. And like there wasn't direct evidence to the extent that they played it up. But like ultimately, like I think they were absolutely right in that this is what a coalition government does. This is what our conservative governments do. And there was this big like uproar in the sort of shitty centrist press, like, oh, this is a bit wrong. It's a bit wrong of Labor to do that. No, that's what needs to be done. Like it does need to be made very, very plain that like there is one side of politics that is going to be doing one set of things.
The same thing happened here.
You actually get that buy-in.
Yeah, we had something similar here where PolitiFact declared it the lie of the year when the Democrats argued that Mitt Romney and the Republicans wanted to privatize or cut Social Security. And they called that the lie of the year, when that was something which the Republicans had totally said they were going to do in all kinds of vague ways and by innuendo.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the way that whole like skewed press ecosystem that we spoke about earlier has the benefit ultimately of redounding to the right. Because like, for example, whilst we had our press up in arms about Labor doing that in one election, in the immediately preceding election, we had Tony Abbott, the Conservative would-be Prime Minister, going literally on the public broadcaster 3 days before the election saying there will be no cuts to pensions, no cuts to education, no cuts to healthcare, like explicitly and blatantly. And then not 6 months later, the most austere budget of the last like 40 years was then handed down that literally like slashed all manner of social services. And at no point, like, whilst there was a little bit of uproar over it, there was no like, resounding critique of that. Certainly not to the extent there was about, Labor's insidiousness with that particular Medicare thing. And it just sort of goes to show the ways in which these things can and will be weaponized by vested interests in ways that actually distort the reality of what's going on.
Yeah, and the same thing happened in Britain, where David Cameron in 2010 said, "We can't go on like this. I'll cut the deficit, not the NHS." And what proceeded to happen? NHS spending was cut by about 1% of GDP, from close to 8% to close to 7% over his ministry. So,
and then the beauty of that for a right-wing government is to then you having deprived it of the funding to operate effectively, you then say it's not operating effectively. It would be better run by, private actors. And then you have the whole pretext by which you start to privatize things. So you deprive government services of the funding to do what they need to do effectively. And then you use that inability as pretext to privatize.
Yeah, that's harder to do in the American case with Medicare and Social Security because they are tied to that very specific set of laws governing provision, tied into the payroll tax. So all of this has made those programs more rigid and more difficult to get without a comprehensive entitlement reform, which would straightforwardly and very nakedly and obviously gut them. But the consequence is that it has created a lot of alienation between older Americans and younger Americans, and a lot of isolation from political causes. If you think about those Bernie Sanders lead-off issues, what are they? Well, Medicare for all, which older people don't need because they've already got Medicare for some. Tuition-free college, which older people don't need because they don't need to go to college. And in many cases, their kids have already graduated from college, if their kids are even going. And then what else? Climate change. Older people are not immediately expecting to be affected by that. Infrastructure spending. By the time you'd get any of that stuff built, it wouldn't make much difference to them. So while we have all kinds of issues that straightforwardly play into the situation of the under 30 voter, there isn't a whole lot that plays into the situation of the older voter. Bernie Sanders has, to his credit, of course, talked about getting rid of the cap, the payroll tax cap. Currently, income above a particular threshold is exempt from payroll tax, which, of course, makes Social Security more difficult to fund. And Sanders has, in the past, talked about eliminating that cap and using that not only to make Social Security more viable in the long term, but also to potentially increase the size of the benefits. And that's a policy which quite expressly is in the interest of older Americans. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of socialists, particularly online socialists, talking about issues that affect old people, in part because old people are not really consuming a lot of the online media anyway. So they're not a demographic that you can readily and easily market your newspaper or your website or your online newspaper, I should say, or your website or your online magazine to.
And particularly within the context of, say we're talking about the Democratic primaries, for example. So older people are one of the most reliable cohorts in terms of voting in primaries and voting in the general as well. And yet at the same time, the degree to which, as we've already outlined, they have both a set of material interests that are in some ways sort of adjacent to, but in other ways contradictory to those of younger people. Plus the fact that they have a very different set of a very different information infrastructure in terms of finding out about the different candidates. Plus just their different set of life experiences and familiarity with different politicians means that it's very easy to sort of forget that to this very reasonably large and influential voting cohort, a candidate like Biden is very much a known quantity who will perform the sort of function that they would need from a president. And so,
someone they would have considered voting for in 1988. Someone they're used to, they're accustomed to. Even
if they didn't back then, it's also that he's managed to launder and develop his reputation in the subsequent 30 years.
Yeah, through his connection to Obama, such that everybody forgets the reasons he dropped out in 88 to begin with, like plagiarizing Neil Kinnock and the bad grades that he lied about and all of that stuff.
But I also think even now, things like that don't matter. I don't think that matters.
No, I don't think it matters, but it mattered to older people in 1988 when he was summarily run out of the race, and now they don't care about that stuff anymore.
Well, I mean, he had a much narrower set of career accomplishments back then to be weighing that against, whereas you add 30 years worth of him being a senator, doing all manner of other things, and then ultimately being VP. It's even if you found that to be a deal breaker then, you're only weighing it against sort of 15 years.
That's true. The other things that have happened since. And of course, that's part of what makes it curious that he was picked to be VP in the first place, and he was
he was also serving a very real function.
Well, right, but he could plausibly work in that function. It's interesting that when Barack Obama looked at him, they didn't see him as this washed guy who only polled at 1% in the 2008 primaries. They saw him as someone who could sell the campaign to middle America.
But I think mostly what you want with a VP is not someone who's especially appealing. You want someone who's just going to kind of perform a signaling function to a cohort that you don't necessarily pick up of your own accord.
Yeah.
And so I think that he is chosen. And so you don't want someone who's polling high, because then you have essentially a sense of tension or competition.
Yeah,
you want
the
someone who's
tendency in
going to be your
American
lackey.
politics is to pick someone a little bit dull, just a little bit dull.
Yeah, you want someone who's going to be your errand boy. You don't want someone who's going to feel like a competitor.
Although it isn't always the way it goes.
I
Sometimes in American
Gore
politics, the runner-up in the primaries is picked as the VP as a kind of party unity move. But it was interesting. He could have picked Hillary Clinton for that, but instead picked her for sex state and picked Biden for VP.
I would never pick, and the Clintons are too Machiavellian to put anywhere near the actual presidency in that way. Plus, Secretary of State's more powerful. You want to give her the experience of wielding power and get her out of the way a bit.
Yeah, I could see why. But then if I were, I don't know why, given the level of personal animosity they had for each other at that stage, why even bother?
Because Obama's a liberal to his bones. He's a dumb liberal.
He was not a very effective president. Anyway, do we have anything else to say about the generation yet?
Simply that probably I think there is a robust case to be made for disenfranchising those over the age of 70.
Or extending the vote to children. One or the other. My supervisor, David Runciman, said on a pod a month or two ago that we ought to give the vote to people from the age of 6, because there really isn't, in his view, any difference between a 6-year-old and an 86-year-old in terms of
yes, but
capacity.
I'm not advocating. I think that's fair, but where I would differ from Runciman is to then say, well, rather than giving it to the 6-year-old and the 86-year-old, we recognize that a 6-year-old and thus an 86-year-old are fucking useless in this particular responsibility of citizenship. And so, no more for you. Bye-bye. Chop.
Of course, the danger is if you strip the vote from those older folks, we can't rely on the rest of us to take care of their programs. And since their programs are specifically set up as their programs, the rest of us cannot be relied on to care.
Yes, care is no basis for substantive political durability. We can't have political programs dependent on
caring about other people without some kind of shared solidaristic material incentive.
So what's the takeaway, Benjamin?
Well, I'd say the takeaway is that there are a variety of reasons why the left has had a hard time dealing with older people. And it's not because older people are bad people or incompetent people, despite that short
I was joking.
Discussion about
joking.
Who should get to vote, right? It comes down to, A, they have access to sets of social programs that younger people don't have any equivalent to, and are therefore oftentimes in a bit better shape than younger people. B, they came up in a time during the Cold War, oftentimes before Watergate and Vietnam changed the way people relate to establishment institutions. Insofar as they did get the experience of Watergate and Vietnam, these were as big exceptions rather than as part and parcel with the way things go. So their attitude to establishment institutions is more deferential. They then don't have the technological background to engage with the anti-establishment left media that is growing up all over the internet, which might shake them out of that, and instead get most of their news from TV and newspapers. And these things continue to give them a very heavily gatekept centrist account of what's going on. All of these things combine together to make it quite difficult for the left to get access to older voters. And in part because these older voters aren't on the internet very much, many people on the left even forget they exist and forget how much political clout and influence they have. And so we just go on acting as if the Democratic primary will be decided by yuppies under 40. And that's just not true. And so every time people go check the Democratic primary poll numbers, they see Joe Biden riding high at 35, 40%. And that's because we just have not figured out how to get access to, talk to, relate to older voters. And that's something that the left is going to have to do. And Bernie Sanders makes an effort with the notion that we should get rid of the payroll tax cap and expand Social Security. But he's not getting any help from the rest of us in that. We're not, the rest of the younger people who follow Bernie are not helping to spread that particular message or make it a dominant message in the campaign. So and maybe that's something that needs to happen.
I have some very, very targeted, pragmatic advice. Rather than waiting till Thanksgiving and, your apocryphal, shitty, creepy, conservative relatives are around the table and having like a whiny, screaming match, call your grandparents. Call them once a week and just start planting seeds. Little conversational seeds about Bernie. Start doing that. It helps. Grandparents, they love hearing from their grandkids. They do.
And they wouldn't want to disappoint you.
To start gradually mentioning all the ways in which Bernie's going to fucking improve your life. And how meaningful and important that is to you. Because guess what's more important to most grandparents? Their grandkids. And do you know what's more influential than any kind of media or anything else? Affect, emotion, sentimentality towards your fucking family members. So start doing agitprop for Bernie. In subtle ways. Call your gran, tell her you love her. Tell her you also love Bernie.
That's excellent advice, Aimee.
I don't mean just once. I mean on a regular basis.
Yeah, so once is not going to be enough.
No, I'm once a week. So she starts associating Bernie with you. And she'll see that old man on the telly and get warm rushes of affect towards her grandkids and start associating him with you feeling better about your life. I'm not even joking. Like, I know I'm using like a sardonic tone, but like I'm not fucking around. Like, seriously, do it. Agitprop for Bernie.
This is the kind of stuff that works. It's not about having some kind of rational ideal deliberation. It's about the ties that people have. Works. It's the ties that people have to one another.
So people are more
leveraging those ties.
And people change their minds gradually and slowly in ways where they are not under a sense of like threat, when it's not hostile, when there's nothing at stake. So if it's just a quiet, unthreatening conversation on an ongoing basis where, you're just sort of slowly starting to build this idea in their heads, it's very, very different than like a heated and involved discussion over the dinner table where a lot of people, especially non-confrontational people, just feel very alienated and like antagonized by that sort of interaction, right? So if you can do it in ways that are just really gentle and ongoing.
A personal phone call is a lot better than a big political blow up in front of the whole family with an audience where people feel defensive and it's a special occasion and it's high pressure.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You want it to be where the stakes are really, really low.
So it sounds like that's what's left. Telling your grandparents about how much you love Bernie. Hey, we ended an episode with an actual statement about what's left that was positive and encouraging.
Yes, I also have one more actually, and I remember this because part of my high school is compulsory to do like community service. And so I did community service at a nursing home for about a year. And I remember being absolutely fucking nauseated when one of the conservative was coming up to the federal election, and more than once there was this totally rubbish candidate for the local electorate, and he would come into the nursing home and give these like presentations. I think he did about 2 or 3 of them in the lead up to the federal election. And that audience is a totally captive audience. And especially if they've met and interacted with this particular candidate on a personal basis, that can often displace a more sort of detached engagement with the candidates and their particular platforms, right? You'll tend to just sort of be like, oh, that was that nice man who came in a couple of times. Yes, I'll vote for him, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so the point being, volunteer for Bernie's campaign and start doing that in nursing homes, going in and doing some agitprop there too, in an organized manner.
It's amazing how many people one can reach if one just gets a little creative. And the 2 kinds of ways of doing it. One is to reach the people in your life who care about you, who love you, and who are going to want you to be happy and you to be well cared for. And the other is to volunteer and go places that you might not otherwise go and talk to people that you might not otherwise talk to. And each of those, it's a different approach, those can both be really helpful.
Just because elderly people, retirees, within this particular society, as we've outlined, like that some material provision has been made for them that whilst it's not elaborate, it is enough to feel like, enough to survive, whatever. That doesn't mean that they are any less deprived of, social and embedded interactions and connections to other people, right? They can be as alienated as we are, and often even more, right? They're not alienated from their work in as much as they're no longer in, a labor relation with a boss, but like people who are older are often the most deprived of the, not just like social interaction, but even like sort of the ability to be able to regenerate that, as you get older, like your friends start to die. There are no real easy institutions by which you can go and like make new friends or whatever. Often your mobility is very limited. So if you can provide to people something that is very real and material in a different way, i.e. social interaction and connection of a kind, then you should exploit that to get them to vote for Bernie.
And I think another thing that
it's a 2 birds, 1 stone.
Another thing that older people face while we're talking about all of the social challenges, the possibility of being a shut-in or living in an assisted living facility or a nursing home where there isn't a lot of interaction you can have with people who aren't either nurses or other people who live in the facility. Another thing that they face is people live their lives in our society, defining themselves by their work, defining their value by the work that they do. And then when people retire, it's often hard for them to find things to do with their time that gives them a sense of purpose and meaning and value. And just like there are plenty of us, plenty of younger people who don't feel like they've got a very strong sense of purpose or meaning or value and go seek that through politics. There are a lot of older, retired people who are looking for something to get involved in, looking for something to do that replaces the role that they imagine that their job might play at one stage in their life. And then maybe it didn't turn out that way. Maybe the job was just a paycheck and they were anxious to retire. But they're still looking for that sense of purpose. And a lot of them may have lost access to it after retiring or may never have had access to that to begin with. And the Bernie campaign could be a vehicle for them in much the same way that it is for younger people. If they're introduced to it in a way that makes it seem like a friendly place to be and not a place where you're going to be picked on all the time.
There's no reason why older people couldn't do phone banking if they got sufficiently inspired or interested.
Right? All of these older people were at some point in time young people who did work on campaigns, and a lot of them have a lot of free time. And one of the things I've noticed in local elections in the states in particular is that almost all the time in state and local races, the candidates are older people. And the campaigns are primarily conducted by having these older people go to various social clubs in the community and talk to the older people in those social clubs. And younger people are never even involved in those local and state campaigns very often because they occur entirely in older people's spaces. And they're waged primarily by retired people with time. So it's not like older people don't do politics and don't even do actual on-the-ground stuff. They do, but they do it differently from the way we do it. And so just because they're not on the internet doesn't mean that they don't have reserves of political energy that we could activate.
And I mean, ultimately, if we really think about it, like I think older people who existed in a world that wasn't unyieldingly neoliberal, right? They have very visceral memories of a world where there was a greater degree of community, there was a greater degree of solidarity. Like the social bonds that have been totally decimated over the past 40 years were not that way when they were growing up. Like I think it's very plausible to make the argument, frame an argument for a Bernie campaign around that sort of notion, right? That Bernie's wanting to reinvigorate and reinstate those notions of collectivity that have been so degraded by the current order. So it's very plausible that you can make a very appealing argument around things that older people are able to relate to through their particular, lens of what they experienced growing up. You don't need to make it around the idea of like tuition-free college, right?
And if you've got the time, it might even be worth getting involved in some of those clubs, some of those, whether it's Kiwanis or Rotary or whatever it might be. If you go along to some of that stuff,
isn't for you.
Why not? If you go along to that stuff, maybe you'll make some friends and maybe you'll have some productive interactions.
Yeah, but also old people are cool as fuck. It's like that sounds condescending, and I genuinely mean it the exact opposite way. Like, it can be so easy to just speak to people of a similar class position and age cohort as yourself. And I think that, modernity is sort of an era where that is a lot more common than it has been sort of throughout human history, right? Like transgenerational existence in close quarters has sort of been the norm for a very, very, very long time, up until possibly sort of the last century or so,
Yeah, and if you don't know any older Bernie voters and you are skeptical about their existence, I know them. I've got them in my family. And these people are out there and you can make more of them. It really can be done. And we are too quick to write off the older generation, particularly people who want to say that older people are too racist or too sexist or too deplorable or too old think on social issues for us. this can't be our attitude. There are too many of them, and they matter too much to treat that way.
So I think we've probably come to the end of that exploration. What do you reckon, Benjamin?
Yeah, I think that's about all that's left.
Alrighty. Wonderful. Well, if you would like to hear another episode of What's Left later this week, and all our previous bonus episodes, you can become a patron at www.patreon.com/whatsleft. And if you would like to get in touch with us on Twitter, we are whatisleft.pod. And you can also reach out via email, whatisleft.pod@gmail.com. But I believe that from us is about all that's left for now. Bye.
Bye.
What we need to do is expand Social Security benefits because people can't make it on $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 a year. And we have to extend the solvency of Social Security a lot longer than 19 years. What do? Well, we do what's obvious, what I think most Americans know we should do. You're making $118,000 a year. She's making $5 million a year. Right now, you're both paying the same amount into the Social Security Trust Fund. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality in America, where the rich are becoming much richer and the middle class is disappearing, it is totally appropriate to say to people who have a whole lot of money, guess what, you're going to have to contribute more into Social Security. What we do is start at $250,000. So people making more than $250,000 will pay the same percentage of their incomes into the Social Security Trust Fund as people making $40,000 or $50,000.